Hi, everybody. This month, I'm asking for your support on Patreon. So if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to my first episode of the year, go ahead and take a listen to that. And I explain a little bit more about why I am so passionate about Patreon. And one of the experiences that I had this past December with some of my patrons, where we had a 1 hour Zoom call, we were able to chat about everything and anything they wanted to talk to me about. And it was an amazing experience, I think, for them, but certainly for me as well. So please head on over to Patreon and help support the show. You can give any amount, $5, $10, $20. You can give less than that, but any little bit helps in supporting life, death, and the space between. Also, make sure you're following me on Instagram at Dr. Amy Robbins. And if you are interested in receiving my newsletter, which has bi-weekly soul wisdoms, please head on over to dramyrobbins.com and subscribe to my newsletter. Lastly, I'm still taking ghost stories for this year. So if you have a ghost story to share, please send that to team@dramyrobbins.com, and I will be excited to share it on my show. Today is part 2 of my 2-part podcast with Mark Epstein, Dr. Mark Epstein, who is a psychologist and Buddhist teacher. I can promise you, you will continue to be enlightened by this conversation. It was amazing, and there are some really juicy tidbits at the end that you can take with you and use today to apply in your life. So go ahead and enjoy the rest of my podcast with Dr. Mark Epstein. And you talk about the division between real life and meditation as artificial.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Well, the division between meditation and real life is artificial. An old friend of mine who's a psychologist in Boston named Jack Engler, he had some of the same teachers, Buddhist teachers that I've had, and he tells a great story about traveling all the way to India, to the village in northern India, Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened, where a Bengali teacher whose name was Munindra, who was Joseph Goldstein, if you know who Joseph Goldstein is, he's one of the premier Vipassana teachers, insight meditation teachers in America. Joseph's teacher was this man, Munindra, who had like an encyclopedic knowledge of Buddhist psychology and was a great meditation teacher. So Jack Engler, my friend, got a Fulbright grant, went all the way to Bodh Gaya, got there, went to Munindra's little cottage, sat down, said, Munindra, I'm ready to learn to meditate. And Munindra wouldn't teach him. He just took him to the marketplace. He asked him how his bowels were now that he had come to India. He showed him what to buy in the market, this a fleecy seed that if you mixed it with water, it was good for diarrhea. If you mixed it with water, it was good for constipation. If you mixed it with milk, it was good for diarrhea. He did this for like 2 weeks. He wouldn't teach Jack to meditate. Finally, Jack said to him, got frustrated, a little angry maybe. And he's like, Munindra, when are you going to teach me to meditate? And Munindra said, oh, you want to learn the Dharma? The Dharma is like the shorthand for the Buddha's psychology. He said, the Dharma means living the life fully. The Dharma means living the life fully. So that was like, big lesson that Jack didn't quite understand at the moment, but wrote down and brought back and has written about and talked about. But so what is he saying? What's Munindra saying? That we set meditation up as like this thing that's apart from life, that's going to, hypothetically enlighten us or awaken us. To what end? Why are we doing all of this? Why do we even feel the need? Because we're not living our lives fully. How are we not living our lives fully? That's the question for therapy. That's I think why people come to therapy, because they have that sense of they're living a superficial aspect, of their own lives. So how can we help deepen or open people to themselves?
Can you speak a little bit to the 3 components of an insight meditation and what they help us, how they help us?
Yeah, sure. Well, we talked about TM already, and the relaxation response. So those meditations are classically called concentration practices or one-pointedness practices, where, as we said before, when the mind wanders, you notice that it's wandering and you bring it back to the central, the mantra or the sensation of the breath, etc. And those concentration practices are very useful, very important to kind of steady the mind, to quiet it enough so that the observing mind, which is really what we're cultivating in meditation, because as human beings, we have this strange capacity, we're both the thinker, but we're able to notice the thoughts. We have a kind of reflective double capacity, to be both subject and object to ourselves. So in psychoanalysis, they talk about that as creating a therapeutic split in the ego, so you have your dreams, but you can look at your dreams. You have your emotions, but you can feel your emotions. So insight meditation is making use of that quality. So the concentration practices are a kind of beginning thing. But then you want to turn your attention on the entire range of your experience. So the distractions, instead of being distractions, become objects of meditation. So a thought arises, and instead of, oh, I'm thinking I should come back to the mantra, you let your observing awareness go to the thought. A bird makes a noise out the window, the refrigerator comes on. You let the sounds be objects of your meditation. Your back starts to hurt, or your heart starts to race. You let those physical sensations become objects of meditation. You have a memory of like when you were a little boy or a little girl, and your friend turned on you, and you still feel the pain of that, and somehow that comes up. You let those feelings or those memories become the objects of meditation. So that's much more mindfulness. And the people who like to make lists, and divide things up, they talk about the concentration practices on the one side, the mindfulness practices on the other side. But the two are like two horses that are drawing a carriage, so we use both of them in most Buddhist practices, Buddhist meditation practices. And then once you get used to treating your experience in this way, then the next stages of practice are called the insight stages. Now, insight means that you're starting to examine what we call the self. Like what is the self? But that's too abstract. So it's really like, who am I? And who do I think I am? And how do I know who I am? So this is all, people get very confused about this. I certainly was never sure about who I was. And like, where am I? And you look like more of a person than I feel like I am, so I want to be like you, but how can I, so the Buddhist insight practices are like, oh yeah, everybody feels this way. So why don't you just like relax and pay attention to how you really do know yourself? When do you feel like yourself, and what is that feeling like? And can you make that the object of meditation? So, and sometimes they talk about that's like a dog chasing its own tail, because you think you found the self, but then you can't find the self, and so and you get a little dizzy, chasing your own self, chasing your own tail. And the Buddhist teachers like that dizziness, because that when you get a little dizzy and you're not quite sure who you are anymore, then there's there's some openings that can happen. There's actually some kind of freedom from the known self or from the demands of the ego. And so things start to unravel a little bit.
So would that in some way be the dissolution of ego?
Well, it's too easy to say that the ego dissolves, because it never really dissolves, but because we all need our egos, and it comes right back. But it's I see it more as uh, realizing the fragility of the ego, or the transparency of the ego, or the relativity of the ego. Like the ego isn't everything, and we don't have to only be our egos. And so the ego has a function, like when we have to make lists, or when we have to make dinner, or get the kids up and out, or ourselves up and out, or be here at the right time. That's all ego function. But do we only have to be like, oh God, what's the next thing that I'm going to do? And no, we don't only have to be that. So the ego has its place, but we can learn to put it down. And that's a lot what we're doing in these practices. Is we're seeing the ego rise up, like it wants to make the lists, and then we're like, okay, I already made that list. So let's like put the ego back down. It can take a rest, and that, I wrote this book, Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart. And that's sort of like letting the ego take a rest. We don't have to be integrated all the time. That doesn't mean that we are disintegrated, but we can be unintegrated. So what does it mean to be unintegrated?
And I have a couple more questions. I actually have a lot more questions, but only a couple more we're going to cover today. What is the Buddhist view on loss? You talk about this a little bit at the end of the book.
Yeah. Well, is there a Buddhist view on loss? Probably not. It probably depends on which Buddhist you're talking to. I had a beautiful, beautiful teaching about that when I was in my 20s and traveling in Asia with Jack Kornfield, who's another mindfulness Vipassana teacher of mine. I went with him and some other friends to the Thai monastery on the Lao border, where Jack had been a monk for 2 years, to meet with his teacher, who was a Thai forest meditation master named Ajahn Chah. And he welcomed us in and gave us lunch, and then we sat and had a like Q&A with him, and we manufactured some kind of question to ask him that I can't remember anymore. But he the answer he gave was about, I think to me anyway, was about loss. And his answer was something like this. He picked up the drinking glass that was next to him, and he said, do you see this glass? I love this glass. It holds my water admirably. When the sun shines on it, it reflects the light beautifully, makes beautiful patterns. When I click on it, it makes a beautiful sound. It has a beautiful ring. But when the wind blows and the glass falls off the shelf and breaks, or when my elbow hits it and it falls and breaks, I say to myself, of course. But because for me, he said, this glass is already broken. But when I know that the glass is already broken, he continued, every minute with it is precious.
Wow.
So it's that last part, like the glass is already broken. That's, okay, Buddhism, suffering, like, everything's impermanent, don't get attached. He wasn't saying that, every minute with it is precious. So I think knowing that loss is inevitable. We are all gonna, if you fall in love, one of you is destined to lose the other, like the old age, illness and death, separation and loss. That's a reality for all of us. Now with COVID, we're experiencing it as, in one moment, everyone together, but that's not usually how it is.
Right.
So in my book, I tell a couple of stories of patients who have lost the people that they're close to, and feeling that the Buddhist view should be, oh, I shouldn't be suffering, I shouldn't be grieving, or I'm not grieving right because I'm not doing it in the 5 stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and whatnot. But I think the trick is to let yourself grieve the way you grieve, which you can't know until you're grieving, until you've really lost someone, and then it's a surprise. It's not a formula, and we can use what we've learned from meditation and therapy, from mindfulness, making room for everything, to not have an agenda for grief, and to appreciate that grief is the other side of love, and that every minute, even every minute of grief, is precious.
And it's almost like a contemplative practice. I mean, I feel like in some ways I do this every day, as I think about, okay, if these people inside the four walls of this house, if something were to happen to them, and others as well, but mainly, those that I feel like I love the deepest, am I good with how I conducted myself today? Am I good with what I said and how I was with them? And sometimes the answer is no. But then it's like, okay, well, what can I do to fix that?
But I think often people don't love as completely as they're capable because they're scared of loss, they're scared of death. Freud wrote a beautiful little paper called On Transience that's about 3 pages long, where he writes about taking a hike in the Swiss Alps in the summer with a poet friend who's said to be Rilke. He doesn't name him as Rilke, but the poet friend isn't able to open to the beauty around him because he knows that it's all transient. So he's like melancholy, on the hike. And Freud ends the paper by saying, it is a flower that blooms for a single night any less beautiful. Which is sort of like Ajahn Chah with the, every minute with it is precious. So I think people who are scared about death and who are seeing loss around every corner, it tends to tighten them up. And so then they're like, they're hypervigilant and overprotective of those that they love. And that's a kind of interfering love, that Winnicott would talk about as, not quite optimal, because then the object of the love has to like guard against that interference.
Right.
And so it creates division,
Okay, so you were friendly acquaintances with Ram Dass. I just interviewed Ramesh. And so these are going to back up together, these podcasts. But one of your patients also was, I guess, worked closely with Ram Dass, and
knew him for a long time. Yeah.
And he brought to you this concept of, he told you that Ram Dass shared this with him: love your thoughts and see yourself as a soul. And this is also in the book, Being Ram Dass. In the end of his life, you went to visit him, and you really beautifully illustrated this notion of seeing souls and then like quickly being back in ego. Can you talk to us about what that's like? Because it was really human. And I appreciated that about his book, and how human he was, even though he was on this spiritual path, and how human you are in your books.
Sure, I'd be happy to try. I knew Ram Dass when I was 20 years old. I first met him. So I think to him, I was always about 20 years old, and then I would see him every decade or two. So we had a nice connection. He had many, many friends who he was much closer to than he was to me, but we had a nice connection in it. And it lasted for, almost 50 years. And the thing about Ram Dass, when he was in his prime, he was like a stand-up comic. He was so funny, and he could tell these stories and bring spiritual principles alive by using his humor. But there was always a little bit of the performer in him, so that who he was in his Richard Alpert, which was his given name, in his Richard Alpert self, and then who he was in his Ram Dass self, they weren't quite aligned, But he had a stroke 25 years before he died that took his voice away. He had an aphasia, so he couldn't find the words that he could still think fine, but so he lost his golden tongue, and he was partially paralyzed. So, and he was in pain, a lot of pain. But somehow in the next decades, he he narrowed that division between the Richard Alpert self and the Ram Dass self, so that he actually became the person that he was always pretending to be, you know? So he never complained. And even though he was really physically suffering, and he continued to just put out a beautiful vibration, you know, to a lot of love to all the people who were around him. And people were really drawn to him because of that. And he helped, you know, he was like a therapist, spiritual therapist to so many people. But so anyway, I went to see him the year or two before he died, because Jack Kornfield, who I mentioned, said to me, "You better go, because he really has become, you know, his energy is really important to be around." And I was kind of tentative, would he remember me and whatnot? But I went and stayed in his guest room. And every Monday, the people around Ram Dass would take him swimming in the ocean in Hawaii, off a particular beach in Maui. And they would put him in like a wheelbarrow, because he was partially paralyzed, and put flotation devices on him and wheel him into the ocean. And in the ocean, his body was, you know, was buoyant. He could float. He was like totally happy. And all these people, you know, retired Maui people, retired LSD people, Maui hippies, you know, like 20 people or so would come and all of a sudden swim with Ram Dass in the water. He did this every week. So I went once during my visit, and I was in the water with him. And it was before COVID, before this idea of creating pods, you know, was part of the vernacular. Ram Dass paddles over to me and whispers to me, "We're like a pod of souls," you know, and we were like whales, you know, like, and then everyone starts chanting together, or it's actually singing nursery rhymes, where row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. And we're all floating in the water together. And then Ram Dass paddles over to me again and points out this one guy over there. And he whispers to me, "That guy's a retired dentist." You know, like he's like the joke of like, you know, he's a dentist. He had a great sense of humor, Ram Dass. And I tried to write this in the book in as moving a way as it felt to me, because it was really a sense of like the, you know, the oceanic feeling, and this pod of souls, like all singing these nursery rhymes in the water, the sun and the ocean, and, you know, really all
And
one,
the playfulness,
you know,
like the
the
childhood,
playfulness,
like
the humor,
joy
yeah,
that just
yes.
is when you look at kids, it's like so soulful.
Yes, and Ram Dass so happy, you know, because you're aware of him suffering, but he was just beaming, beaming, beaming. So so that all happened, and then finally everyone gets back on land, and Ram Dass says he's taking everybody out to lunch, which is at a Thai restaurant in a strip mall, and so there's 20 people, you know, sitting at this table, and suddenly everyone's back in their egos, back in their bodies, back in their egos, and the waitress comes and she's getting the iced tea orders, and some people want, you know, iced tea with no milk, and some people want it with no sugar, and some people Splenda, and one person wants everyone to turn their cell phones off because of the electromagnetic radiation. And I'm getting judgmental about everybody, you know. So this like transcendent experience is now reduced to like a regular old lunchtime thing. But Ram Dass was sitting across from me, and he was just like the same, you know, just like happily eating his food. And he looked up at me once to let me know that everything was okay, you know, that real life and the ocean didn't have to be two separate things, you know. So
how do we get to that place? I think I would have been right with you at the table. Same thoughts.
Well, even being in that place was in that place, you know, like that was really the like, you can't stop your mind, you can't stop your ego, but you don't have to buy into it totally. That's I think the best that we can do. And that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you a couple? I do this little fun speed round thing at the end. Can I ask you
Sure.
some fun speed round questions?
You can try.
Okay. Spirituality means
That you're not who you think you are.
what is something most people don't know about you?
I like sports.
What is one thing you are really looking forward to right now?
The Super Bowl.
Even with those two teams playing in it, huh?
Come on.
I know. What a series we've had. These playoffs have been unbelievable. What is one thing you are deeply grateful for right now?
My wife.
What book is on your nightstand right now?
The 1,000-page biography of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark.
What is your favorite spiritual or healing practice?
Iyengar yoga.
And what is the most transformative experience of your life?
Falling in love.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I have more questions, but I don't want to take up more than
Invite
an hour.
me back.
I would love to have you back.
Okay.
The Zen of Therapy is out now. It is beautiful. It is, I mean, I can't say enough good things about it. As everybody knows who listens to the podcast, I try to get through every single book. I read this cover to cover. You can see my notes as proof. And it was just really a great read. It was also just in the New York Times, I believe, right? Just last week. To great reviews as well. So thank you so much, Mark. Where can people find you if they're interested in learning more about your work? Do you have openings right now? For therapy?
I have a web. They can find my website, which is markepsteinmd.com, I think. And I have a Facebook page that usually lists all the talks or whatever if I'm doing anything. So those are really the best ways.
Isn't that the $1 million question right now? Don't you feel like that's the question that everybody's asking?
What's
the
question?
Do you have openings?
Oh, no, everyone is not asking that question.
Oh,
no,
I
no,
feel like
a trickle of people.
I feel like I'm getting a lot of,
question.
do you have openings? Can you refer me to people for openings?
Yeah.
Who can I?
Yeah, no, it's hard for me to take on any new people right now because
I bet.
feel, responsible to the people that I'm still working with. But
well, thank you so much for your time today. And I would love to have you back if you would come.
Okay, well, it's so nice to meet you.
And too.
I really appreciate that you read the book and thought about the questions and everything. So
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, that's a wrap, as they say.
As they say. Good.
Thank you. Yes,
Welcome.
that was awesome. I didn't want to make it shorter because I love to learn. So
how long did we go?
Like an hour.
An hour, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I might cut it in two. Sometimes
yeah,
I
do whatever you want.
So and I will email you I'll email you once the podcast goes live. I think it's in a couple weeks. Okay. And I'll send it to Gail as well.
Okay, that's great. And I'll send it. There's a person who does my Facebook stuff. So if you send it to me, I'll send it to her and
perfect.
It'll go up there. Perfect.
And if the next time you have a book.
This might be it, but we'll see.
No, really?
Yeah, we'll see.
I just am starting a proposal. So for myself, kind of daunting.
Yeah. Have you had Laura Lynn Jackson on? I have. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I like her.
Yeah. Yeah, she's great. I have her book. I use her book to prop up my computer.
Yeah, I have a bunch like that too. Yeah. I think her first book was better, but
the Light Between Us, was that her first book?
Yeah.
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 I didn't read that. I don't think I read that one. I've read so many spiritual books. It's like I can't even remember anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. You too.
You too.
Okay.
Good. Bye.
Bye-bye.